Chilean army orders overnight curfew for the fourth day in a row as nationwide anti-government protests continue. Prime Minister Boris Johnson puts his Brexit deal on hold after the British Parliament rejects his timetable. Israel's Benny Gantz is expected to try forming a coalition government after Prime Minister Netanyahu once again fails to do so. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo and this is from the South. The Chilean army has ordered an overnight curfew for the fourth day in a row as anti-government protests continue across the country. A broad platform of social movements has also called a general strike for Wednesday and Thursday. The protests have been met with violent repression as many major cities have been militarized under presidential orders. As of Tuesday afternoon, the death toll from this repression stands at 15, with close to 1,500 people being detained. Massive protests started last week after the government increased the price of metro fares by 30 pesos, while on Monday, Congress struck down this decision, bringing metro fares back to normal. The protests have evolved into widespread anger against the neoliberal model, in particular growing inequality and repression.
This is how the inside of Chile's presidential palace looked on Monday evening. The peaceful environment was a stark contrast with what was happening outside these walls, where protesters headed home after a long day of demonstrations and of violent police repression. But their energy remained high as they continued to condemn the president's response to their demands. They say that all the pressure that has been built up for 30 years finally exploded. But back inside the palace, after hours of waiting to hear the president speak, this is what he had to say.
I know I have had harsh words against the violence and criminal activity we're seeing, but fellow citizens, please understand, what I do out of indignation for the brutal violence by small organized groups whose plans are carried out with pure malice.
The very same words he has repeated since the crisis started last week, when students started their massive evasion campaign, protesting a hike in metro fares. As the demonstrations grew in size, Piñera imposed a state of emergency and a curfew at night. The only thing that's left is to call the citizens subversive in order to return to the Pinochet dictatorship of the 70s and the 80s. But besides damning the thousands who are taking the streets and the few who have looted stores, Piñera also shows some concern for the people's demands.
We need to come together and have bilateral talks. We need to collaborate with goodwill and reach accords with those who want to join these talks. On Tuesday, I will meet with the leaders of the opposition parties.
But these so-called delinquents are not invited to these talks. The military, far from returning to their bases, are now also patrolling cities during the daytime with weapons in hand, providing support to their brothers in arms, the police special task force known as Carabineros. Maybe they hope to run people out of the streets, but they have been met with defiance and disgust. But back to the presidential palace, the president continued his speech.
Today we extended the state of emergency to more states, Atacama and Los Lagos.
Such repression comes from a government that stands on a pedestal and lectures countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua on human rights. According to the government and corporate media, these protesters are cowards. But cowards is far from a truthful description when they take over entire streets without any weapons, and they resist, despite attacks with tear gas, toxic water, rubber bullets, and nightsticks. So far, 15 people have lost their lives in this protest.
The armed forces have taken the streets, but the people are not going to let anyone step on them. They continue coming out to protest. Most of them are young, but many are also older. We are seeing women, men, children. We demand an end to the abuse, an end to corruption. Chile has said enough exploitation, and we are yelling this in their face.
But the question remains. What does the government want to achieve with the state of emergency? And where is this protest heading, which started spontaneously and became massive, but has no leaders or political platform?
Yesterday, along with social organizations, we tried to establish a number of working points for people to discuss. First, free public transport for students and senior citizens and a rise in the minimum wage. In Chile, we live in precarious conditions. Most people do. We want an end to misery and to the pension reform. We want the tax reform to be repealed too because it only favors the rich. We want a mandatory 40-hour working week. All these demands and these protests are for the sake of our dignity.
We need a leader that helps us leave behind this neoliberal model. We need a representative, not a politician. Because the left and the right have failed us. They have been robbing us for more than 30 years. They want this country for themselves. They don't want to share with us. But people have had enough. All of Chile is united and asking for change because we can't trust those in power.
Night brings many dangers for anyone without a safe passage pass. The police officers who captured these young people told us they were protecting them from evildoers. They did not let us talk to the detainees, who were taken to a police station for the crime of walking home. If the curfew reminds us of the dictatorship, we are also reminded of the resistance. Neighbors come together in corners or outside buildings, ready to enter their homes if the army shows up. They make noise with empty pots and pans and yell out slogans. But according to Piñera, these people want to destroy Chile.
Russia and Turkey have agreed to remove Kurdish militia to beyond 30 kilometers from the Turkish border. Once the Kurdish militia is removed, Russian and Turkish troops will take joint control over a vast swath of formerly Kurdish-held territory in northern Syria within 10 kilometers of the border. Russia's foreign minister said the Kurds would also be removed from the towns of Manjib and Tel Rifat. The deal was struck after Putin and Erdogan held marathon talks in Sochi, Russia. It also comes just hours before the end of a U.S.-mediated truce between Turkish and Kurdish forces in Syria.
Starting 12 p.m. noon of October 23, within 150 hours, YPG terrorists and their arms will be taken out of 30 kilometers depth. Their fortifications and positions will be destroyed. After 150 hours, in the west and the east of the area of Operation Peace Spring with a depth of 10 kilometers, Turkish and Russian joint patrol will begin. All YPG terrorists in Tel Rifat and Manbij will be taken off this area together with their arms.
The results from the official count of Sunday's presidential election in Bolivia show that President Evo Morales is likely to go into a runoff vote with his main rival. As of Tuesday afternoon, with over 92% of all ballots counted, Morales has a clear lead with 45.27% of the vote, while his closest rival, Carlos Mesa, stands at 38.16%. According to the Bolivian Constitution, a candidate needs a 10-point advantage in the first round in order to avoid a runoff vote. And as the whole nation is awaiting for official results, supporters of President Morales have called for demonstrations to defend the vote. But just as most citizens started their celebration, violent opposition groups have made their dissatisfaction with the results known. In a number of cities, including Potosí and Sucre, protesters set fire to the electoral court's buildings, with at least 2 people being forced to jump out of a second-floor window to save their lives. These violent groups have also targeted the campaign houses of the Movement Towards Socialism party. In light of opposition violence, Bolivia's National Coordination for Change, an organization made up of social and indigenous movements affiliated to the ruling party, have declared themselves in a state of emergency.
Once more, our electoral process has shown that Bolivians are a democratic people and has highlighted to workers and the majority of citizens that the right-wing and the business sector work only for their own benefit and not for the good of Bolivia. Therefore, we are declaring a state of emergency and a national mobilization, with a first peaceful demonstration to be held on Wednesday in the Plaza San Francisco in La Paz.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In recent weeks, mass protests have erupted in several cities around the world. In many instances, what binds these demonstrators is their anger over high levels of inequality and their demands for good governance strategies. There's a call for Caribbean leaders to take heed.
11 people counted dead in Chile from protests yesterday. People in Lebanon rising up. No one knows what will happen in the Mediterranean or in Asia over the course of the next few months or a year, because the world finds itself in that point of turbulence. And mercifully for us, we've been able to hold any threat to the Caribbean Sea from Venezuela down. All this does is to reinforce why it is necessary for us to be strategic and to work together in partnership to be able to create that oasis of happiness that all human beings long and want. But we can't do it by serendipity.
Meanwhile, Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holmes has lamented that so-called wealthy countries have failed to deliver on their climate finance pledge to provide $100 billion in aid each year by 2020. The money is intended to help vulnerable nations ward off and adapt to the effects of climate change.
Today, we are less than 3 months away from 2020, and the global progress and action towards making financing available to countries like Jamaica is woefully inadequate. My text says it's still not enough, but the truth is it is woefully inadequate. There is greater understanding, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the Climate Action Summit amongst world leaders. There is no question. You're seeing greater action, greater individual action, greater awareness. But even though we have the agreement and we have COP21, I don't think we are where we should be today if we are serious as a global community to avoid the foretold effects of climate change.
Protesters remain on the streets across Lebanon well into Tuesday night on the 6th day of anti-government demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of protesters flooded the streets of Lebanon since last Thursday as they keep pressuring the government to tackle the country's economic crisis. Demonstrations were initially sparked by a proposed tax on WhatsApp and other messaging apps, but have grown into an unprecedented mobilization against the political class. Aiming to diffuse their anger, the government announced a set of economic measures on Monday, including to fight corruption. But the moves did not go far enough to persuade demonstrators to leave the streets. To talk more about the situation in Lebanon, earlier we spoke with Jana Yasmin Nakal from the Central Committee of the Lebanese Communist Party.
Currently, streets are closed between cities. The biggest demonstrations that took place in the past 5 days took place yesterday with more than 2 million people. The biggest today, just half an hour ago, the two biggest piazzas in downtown Beirut were fully covered with people. Cities around the country, major cities, small cities, towns and villages are either demonstrating or they have their roads closed. Yesterday, more than 65,000 people went to the streets. So we're talking about neoliberal policies. We're talking about also social policies. These demonstrations are incredibly diverse when it comes to refugees joining, when it comes to specifically women. In this country, women have legally women have the rights of women are very much to their minimum. Lebanese women cannot give their nationality to their kids. in the case of marriage from outside, from a different nationality. One of the most important issue is the civil status law, where Lebanese women have to follow one of the 18 sects. Of course, it's the husband sect. To have a marriage, where we all know how patriarchal religions are. And so for years now, for I think the past 3 years, a beautiful movement of women have grown from inside the different sects, demanding for civil marriage, demanding for reforms within the religious contracts.
The governments of Mexico and the United States have agreed on a joint strategy to halt the illegal arms trade fueling violence in Mexican cities. This comes days after a large-scale shootout between the Sinaloa drug cartel and security forces put the people of Culiacán in grave danger.
President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has said that issues in Mexico will be resolved without any foreign intervention. These comments came after he spoke to the President of the United States, Donald Trump, about the violence seen on October 17 in the city of Culiacán.
These matters, no matter how delicate, have to be resolved with sovereignty, independently by Mexicans, just like we respect other sovereignty. We want ours to be respected as well.
According to official reports, on October 17, Ovidio Guzmán López, the son of the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, was detained and then later released.
This was a direct attempt at capturing a known criminal with a provisional detention order in order to immediately extradite him by the order of a federal judge.
During the firefights that broke out after Ovidio Guzmán López's detention, cartel members used high-caliber weapons that had been smuggled into the country.
It's evident that arms trafficking is essential for cartels to hold as much power as they do, because they can respond to any threat in their territory in full force.
The National Defense Ministry has reported that 70% of weapons used by organized crime in Mexico come from the United States, which led to a meeting between authorities to discuss the topic. After this meeting, Mexico's Foreign Ministry announced that new steps are being taken in order to stop the illegal arms trade.
A court in Guinea has jailed 5 protest leaders for organizing demonstrations. The court handed down jail terms of up to a year against the leaders of opposition protests, which took place this month. They were found guilty of initiating a wave of unauthorized protests on October 14th that brought much of the West African state to a standstill. Lawyers for the defendants said they are going to appeal the sentence. At least 10 people have been killed during the protests.
We were not surprised because coming to this trial, we knew that everything was already lost. But we will continue to fight to defend the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution.
A severe drought that has struck several countries in southern Africa is having devastating effects on wildlife. According to the Zimbabwe Wildlife Management Authority, 55 elephants have died in the last 2 months in the country's largest national park due to starvation and dehydration. The drought has also led to a rise in animal-human conflicts as more elephants are forced to stray from parks into neighboring communities in search of food and water. 20 people have been killed by elephants in southwest Zimbabwe this year alone. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Israeli politician Benny Gantz is set to start forming the country's next coalition government after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu failed to do so. The country's president Reuven is expected to task Gantz with setting up the next government following Netanyahu's announcement that he was giving up on forming the government after failing to win support from a majority of parliament. This will be the first time in a decade someone other than Netanyahu will be asked to form a government in Israel.
Gantz's party has one more seat than Netanyahu's Likud, but still is far, far away from the majority that he needs. He has to bring together multiple other parties, not 1 or 2, but 5 or 6. Ideologically, they will not sit together. So this is not just a numbers game of reaching a majority, it's also an ideological game, which Netanyahu failed at and which doesn't look like Benny Gantz will be capable of succeeding at, unless he does something that has only been done once in the history of this country, which is to present a minority government with outside support that will give it a majority.
The British Parliament has voted to reject the government's accelerated timetable for passage of a bill that would implement Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. This could derail Johnson's plans for Britain to leave the EU by October 31st. Initially, MPs supported the withdrawal agreement bill, passing it by a majority of 30 votes. But immediately after, the Prime Minister faced another crucial vote, this time on the so-called programme motion. It's a proposal to speed up the timeline for the bill to pass through all its stages in the House of Commons. The UK government had asked for everything to be wrapped up by this Thursday. Well, MPs voted down that proposal, effectively throwing Britain's departure from the European Union into uncertainty. Earlier, the Prime Minister warned that he would scrap his Brexit deal and push for a snap general election if lawmakers dismissed his plan.
Mr. Speaker, I must express my disappointment that the House has again voted for delay, rather than a timetable that would have guaranteed that the UK would be in a position to leave the EU on October the 31st with a deal. And we now face further uncertainty, and the EU must now make up their minds.
In an immediate reaction, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn told the Prime Minister he is the author of his own misfortune. Corbyn then put an offer on the table.
Work with us, all of us, to agree a reasonable timetable, and I suspect this House will vote to debate, scrutinise, and I hope amend the detail of this bill. That would be the sensible way forward, and that's the offer I make on behalf of the opposition tonight.
Following Prime Minister Johnson's decision to put the Brexit deal on hold, European Council President Donald Tusk said in a tweet that he would recommend that the UK's exit from the EU is, once again, delayed. China has accused United States officials of making decisions based on lies in their dealing with the country. China's Foreign Affairs Ministry said that concerns that China may attempt to interfere in the U.S. 2020 elections are ridiculous.
Individuals in the United States, out of their own self-interest or a political plot, have done everything to suppress and smear China, even to the point where there is no bottom line. Making up and selling lies, even making decisions based on lies, is not only ridiculous but also extremely dangerous. We also see that the United States has stirred up wars in Syria, Iraq, and other places by fabricating lies. Now, whether it is on the issue of Hong Kong, Huawei, or the Belt and Road Initiative, including the meddling of the U.S. election mentioned by the Russian media just now, the lies made by the U.S. are still continuing.
Canada's Liberal Party leader Justin Trudeau has retained power in a narrow victory on Monday's federal elections, but he will now be Prime Minister of a minority government. On Tuesday, the Liberal Party obtained 157 seats in Parliament, falling 20 short of the number needed for a majority. The leader of the Conservative Party, Andrew Scheer, managed to scoop 121 seats, while the New Democratic Party won 24 seats. Trudeau's first term in office was marked with a number of scandals, in particular his handling of the bribery prosecution of engineering giant Singh Lavali. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.